Howdy, this is Zefer. Welcome to episode 3 of Therian Talks, the Therian Guide podcast that aims to bring some of our forum discussions and general information about therianthropy into audio format. Today we have with us BearX, the cheerful, nameless, adorable bear.
Oh, howdy.
And again, DustWolf, the big, bad, friendly wolf.
Hi there.
And of course, myself, Zefer Nezumi, the big, fluffy, derpy tiger, as the show host. Today we'll be discussing the history of the Therian community and how it's changed over the years. This is a topic suggestion that was brought up by Blue Dragon on Therian Guide forums. As we discussed in the last episode, DustWolf became involved in the community sometime before 2002. Dusty shared some of his information about the community at that time, but there's more to look into with this topic. We're fortunate to have BearX with us this time. Bear has been in the community since even longer, and so we're going to open up discussion for both of these critters to reflect on the history of the community and how it's grown over time. So before we begin, Bear, we mentioned that you're part of the community for many, many years, but for context, when did you first learn about the Therian community?
So when I was very young, early 80s, I had felt that I was not human. The experience that we've all been through, right? Where you don't know what's quite going on, and it's a relief when you find the online community. There was no online community. It took finding a site called Alt Horror Werewolves, or AHWW, and there were surprisingly like-minded people there. Not initially, but after a few months of folks talking and opening up to one another, many of us found that we all shared that. And so I discovered Alt Horror Werewolves, or AHWW, sometime in late 1993, so right at the start of the community. That was before any of us who were Therians on there knew that there were other folks who were Therians. The word didn't even exist. We were wares or whatever. So yeah, it was quite some time ago.
So this was like, if I did the math correctly, like 26 years ago. I think this is like important to note because a lot of people haven't even been alive for that long. You know, it's been quite a while. For myself, like I've mentioned in the previous podcast, I've discovered therianthropy about a decade after that, and Alt Horror Werewolves was no longer a big thing then, but it was still around.
Yeah, unfortunately for myself, I didn't poke my snout into the community until probably around 2005 or so. So I came even later than that, but even since then, I've seen some changes. So would you say that the community has changed a lot since you first encountered it?
Yeah, the community's changed significantly. I took a hiatus from the online community and spent a lot of time with the offline community. People who had been part of the online Therian community in the past, but drifted away for whatever reasons. But I still got together with them for quite a while. And after some of them moved away, I got back involved with the online community. And so the changes that have happened in the community were very stark for me, because the difference in the way the community operated when I left and when it came back was pretty significant. There were different places, different people, and some of the things that were foundational or fundamental about therianthropy in the 90s and early 2000s were viewed differently now.
So what is it that you missed most about the early Therian community then?
Oh, we had a lot more frequent meetups. I would get together pretty regularly with folks. There were howls and mini howls. I used to go camping with a couple of the other bears from Usenet, from Alt Horror Werewolves. We'd go to Shenandoah National Park, and then I'd get together with Remel and Leo every summer and hang out with them. And so it was a lot more get-togethers. And I suppose that is the biggest thing I miss. It's nice that howls are starting up again, but I think that um, personal interaction is kind of important. Um, Hard to say exactly where that fits in, but yeah, that's what I miss most.
Well, from my side, uh, since I'm here on the other side of the world, I never really had the chance to attend any halls. Um, and I find it also interesting, BearX, that you mentioned that you were so involved with this. When I was on Altar Werewolves, admittedly that was much later than you, I never really seen anybody talk about halls. It was I never noticed that until I encountered the word again later on websites.
So it was kind of interesting for me. Again, I didn't come into the community until around 2005, but even so, I kind of stayed on the outside for the most part. But one of the wolves that I knew around that time frame, he would talk about howls quite frequently, and he always talked about it like almost like it was a thing of legend. There was a lot of energy there. There was a lot of fun times. But it was interesting because around that time, it's almost like they were a lost thing as far as conversations had gone. Like they had seemed to die down. Bear, do you have any idea as to why things like howls have become less frequent? And I guess for those who don't know what a howl actually is, what would you describe it as, and why do you think they're important?
It's a fairly large collection of things to unpack.
Yes.
Let me see. So I'll start with what a howl is. Because of the preponderance of wolves in the community, the the in-person get-together of a group of Therians ended up with the sound that wolves make to communicate over a distance. So it was called a howl, and there were in the beginning there were big ones. They were large. As many as could get together at the same time would get together. The first few were in Ohio, and then, but it became too big, and so it broke up into more regional ones for ease of getting to them. And over time, I think there have been changes culturally. Um, People are a lot more anxious about strangers now, despite statistically us being safer. The media tends to push this narrative that if there's someone on the internet, they're dangerous. And honestly, I've always felt safer around groups of Therians than just about any other random group of folks that I know of. Um, so that's a thing that's changed, and a lot of the folks are younger. The community average age has drifted younger over time. That's not a good or bad thing. It's just a thing. The downside of it is that young folks aren't able to go places, and they're um, you know restricted in a lot of ways. And if there is an unsafe situation, they're minors, and so there has to be someone who looks after them. And so all of those things kind of play into it. And many folks are afraid to tell their parents, so you know uh they would have to be chaperoned. I mean, it ends up being complicated. And I think that's probably the largest reason, is that the age of folks have gotten younger, and it's harder for young people to participate in that kind of thing, especially when it's something that many are nervous about people knowing about them.
Yeah, I would agree with what BearX had said here. I think it's quite obvious from our discussion about our horror werewolves so far that the older generation was really into house, but then when people changed around, the younger people who only had access to the internet and couldn't meet up in person never encountered these people who organized this house, and so this kind of died out over time, as even when these younger people became older people. I think I should point out, however, that Pink Dolphin, the YouTuber, has made some videos about how to organize a Therian meetup, and it doesn't seem to be that complicated. You just need other Therians to meet with.
And it's something interesting too, because I know I've only really tried participating in the community in a more active sense for about a year and some change. But a few months ago, I started wondering, why haven't we had any howls for a while? And then I kind of decided to take it up for myself, and I'm like, okay, well, let me try to organize one. I had no idea what I was doing, but I know I kind of approached BearX a few times to, for ideas about how to continue that process. But it really wasn't that hard. So, uh, the community does have the power to kind of almost empower itself to make these things happen. You don't have to kind of passively watch them go into the annals of history. We can put effort forward to kind of revive them. Bring back parts of the past. It is important to. I know it's easier for us to connect over the internet. Many of us live hours and hours away from each other, so it's not very frequent that we can do these kinds of in-person meetups, but it is a very important part of the experience. So, Bear, would you say overall that things have changed for the worse over the years, or are you glad some things have changed?
So everything in life is change of one kind or another. Um, and so, yeah, there have been negative changes. But I'm a cranky old cynic and I'm kind of resistant to change. Yeah, I'm a walking, talking stereotype, I guess, in some ways. Um, I mean, there are things like I wasn't happy when I came back and I found out that therianthropy was considered a subcategory of otherkin. Um, because for me, those groups have an independent origin and grew up independent of one another, have a different culture. Um, and in many ways, I think therianthropy is more than an identity, but that's a large and complicated topic and not really germane to what you asked me. Um, but I do kind of feel like merging those groups together takes away from the independent culture that each of them had. I kind of like the ultra human movement, right? Because that gives a new umbrella that also allows the vampires and the fae and the different groups to all have a single uniting umbrella that describes all of it and yet maintain their independent cultures. And that fragmentation happened in the early community too. The fragmentation that we see in the community here, where there is lots and lots of small sites, and uh, that I ran a site of my own back in the day, lycanthrope.org. So I guess I was party to that. I don't know. I suppose that fragmentation can be good for informational web pages and diversity of expression, but I have trouble keeping up with all the different forums and live chats and things that are going on there. So I guess that's negative. But there's positives too. I like that we're getting more exposure. I like that grilling is kind of going away. I was never a fan of grilling. I always felt it was a practice that drove away, not just those who were trolling, but legit individuals for whom that process um, was painful. Um, it was only really a common practice in a few places in the community, but it definitely had a lasting impact. And I suppose another thing that had changed and that was different was the research angle that really gets pushed in the modern community. I didn't do a lot of research until after I figured out my stereotype, so I could understand bears better. I always felt that inner discovery shouldn't be like a term paper. It should be soulful and meaningful. It should be about plumbing one's inner depths, and you can't really do that with a book. You can only really do that by looking inside yourself. I mean, for some people, if you gotta have your nose in a book, fine. But for me, I had to understand my own feelings.
Myself, my perspective on this is like I always like to be kind of in step with the recent trends because I might be wrong about something, and the only way to learn if something new is okay or better even than what you're already used to is just to go into it and see what it's all about. That's one of the main reasons that I came back to Therian Guide like 15 years later, right? Um, so I agree that not all of the changes in the community recently have been super great, but um, you know, I think maybe some of the changes happened because like the older generation of Therians kind of lost interest and never really passed on this information to the younger generation that's changed a few things, and maybe some of this was probably also destroyed in like the creation of Tumblr and the echo chamber that it represents. Um, I think the community overall has actually come a long way, and a lot of the things that are very vague and unclear back in the days of Altar Warbles was have since been clarified and since been made a lot more well understood. So I think that's a good thing. And like this recent happening that scientists are starting to get interested in therianthropy, I think this is really cool. Just could be some interesting things that they could determine, like understanding what therianthropy really is. Um, and I think like if we just kind of try to bridge these two worlds, like get in touch with the older Therians like BearX, and combine this with the modern way of looking at things, then maybe there could be some very positive effects to look forward to.
That's something I try to keep in mind too. As with both of you, I poked my snout into the community for a while, and I took some time away. When I came back into the community, some of the labels and definitions had changed. I know I did a minor introduction somewhere where I said that I connected with the tiger, and I didn't realize that those words were no longer associated with kinship; they were applied to kith. So I think some of the changes that I've seen personally are kind of like growing pains as we have more people um, explaining their experiences. We have a growing community. We're trying to tweak how we understand things and move along with it. Well, sometimes those things they change in ways that almost seem like they invalidate someone's experience just over semantics, and it's not necessarily how things should be approached. Sometimes it's just a miscommunication. Sometimes it seems like it's more of a misinformation of sorts. But as time progresses, some of the things that we discover about the community also evolve. And like you said, we're actually in the process of being understood from a scientific perspective. So it's important to just kind of try to describe our experiences the best we can as we do, and to understand that sometimes there's a different generational approach in describing how you've experienced what you have. No one should really jump to conclusions and say you're not Therian, or try to describe or prescribe certain labels just based off of that. So for both of you, I guess, what are your views on today's Therian community? This will be things like Therian Guide, Amino, social networks, that kind of thing.
Yeah, they're complicated, right? Because in many ways, I feel out of place. Because many of the older Therians in the community sort of drifted away to do their own things, it's left a fairly large age gap. Even on TG, most of the folks are significantly younger than me, and so uh, it can be a little hard. I do wish that more of the older AHWW folks were still involved because we'd figured a bunch of things out. We'd done things that the howls had different spirit work. Like there was a lot of knowledge there that sort of got lost, and sort of my views on therianthropy in general are a ba bit different from the modern community because I have ideas about a spectrum of animality, and I think it's a lot more than just an identity. So for me, I have a big umbrella of what therianthropy is, and it gets frustrating when I'll mention something, and then some very young person will run in, and they'll say they're a gray muzzle. They've been in the community for 2 years, and what you're saying isn't therianthropy, and it obviously was therianthropy. Uh, and so I guess the nature and the definitions keep changing, but those changes are treated as eternal fact when really, until those scientists you mentioned do more research, I don't think we're going to know exactly what therianthropy is. And I think even after they do that research, we're probably only going to have a general idea. Um, I mean, I think folks put too much importance on on their stereotype. Um, it's this giant search. So many questions. How do I find my stereotype? And what is my theory? And this stereotype, stereotype, and it it's it's something that you just got to be chill with. Uh, you know, and I'm hopeful that a lot of understanding of those things will come more uh, through increased exposure. I think people who have these animal experiences will suddenly find, there's a place for me to go where folks will understand this inner sense of non-humanity I have, and I don't know. I think it's good.
Yeah, I think that these problems that you mentioned there have actually more to do with age groups than they do with like anything being wrong with the community that we have. I think like it's natural for very young people to like to explore life through role playing and pretending, and it's also natural for teenagers to like resort this rampant tribalism that is all over the internet right now, and this us versus them mentality that we often frown upon. I think this is just human nature, you know. The forums that we have joined, like you and me, when we joined like Therian Guide, these forums were always more attractive to teenagers who were like discovering their identity and discovering where they belong in the world. So this is why it was so popular to grill people and exclude them, because this was like the main part in so many people's lives at that point because of their age. It was discovering their place in the world also means that discovering the place where the other people do not belong, right? So finding out what you are, who you are. This is why this whole identity dimension has become so over exaggerated, because this is just something that's important to teenagers. And I think, like, for example, places like Amino or YouTube are popular to people even younger than 13, maybe because these sites never actually check how old you are before entering them. And uh, we know from like data of visitors coming from Amino that many of them are younger than 13. And I think this is just a consequence of the internet, like you said earlier, becoming more and more accessible to younger people. Like today, you have all phones which have these touch interfaces, which are much more intuitive to younger people than keyboards. And so you have many more younger people coming onto the internet, coming in contact with us. And I think this more than anything is affecting how we perceive the modern community. It's really just another challenge in adapting to how things are changing these days.
Yeah, can I add that I don't mean to sound like I'm down on teenagers and younger folk. I'm absolutely not. I totally remember what it was like to be that age, and I know that there's this whole sense of belonging that's important and all of that. Um, my frustrations only come from the long-term health and well-being of the community, making sure that it doesn't become something that's about aesthetics and that remains something about a journey of personal discovery.
So it's really about a balance between the old and the new. It's almost like the younger generation should kind of look to what the older generation has developed over time of what that history was, but at the same time, maybe kind of challenge what some of those traditions were. At the same time, not necessarily ostracize, not take over per se, but kind of work together to continue the understanding and the trends that were in place. There's no need to completely redefine everything. Again, if there have been many people who have had this experience since, at least in an online sense, since the early 90s, there's no, it's 2018 now. There's no light switch to kind of redefine things. It's better to kind of work together and, again, kind of work to build the community rather than fragment it. If some things need to be redefined, that's fine, but I think that's something that everyone should work together to come to a conclusion with, not necessarily younger Therians or not necessarily older Therians. All right, Bear, you said that folks put too much importance on their stereotype. Well,
Yes.
Does that mean that, me being a Siberian tiger isn't important at all? What do you suggest that people actually focus on if stereotype isn't the thing that they should?
Yeah, well, I used to think it was super critical, right? And I think that may have been from the fact that very often in some get-together, I would be the only bear Therian. It would be the bear among wolves, right? And I used to think it was a big deal, that wolf Therians had their way, and bear Therians are their way, and the draconics are another way, and but what those experiences taught me is that it's artificial, right? We're much more similar than we are different. I feel like one stereotype is more like a decoration, right? It's just a wrapper. It's the wolf-shaped box that our therianthropy comes in. It's not, it isn't the truth of it. It's it's you being a tiger is important, right? It's important to you personally. But when it comes to the grand scheme of the community and the interactions with it, it's just a wrapper, at least in my view. And I think it gets used to divide us into artificial groups. I've seen these chat groups get formed. They're Wolf Therian chats. And, it's fine to have a chat area where you discuss only your type, but it's an artificial hierarchy, right? It's like packs, right? Packs have assumed this undue importance lately. And, back in the day, it was just a fun nickname for your clique, the group of Therians who you hung out with the most. Pardon me. And now it has assumed this very formal idea of alphas and betas and all. And it, I'm not sure what that ends up doing, other than breaking groups into smaller groups with artificial hierarchies. So I think we should focus on the commonalities, the things that make me the same, make me like you, make me the same as Dust's experiences. Like what do we all share, and why do we feel a need to have a stereotype in the first place? And why do some people's change? There'll be a wolf Therian for 15 years, and then they'll say, "Oh, I feel like it's something different." Is there a reason why it's rare, but it does happen. And how can we make the community more inviting and comfortable for Therians who are only now discovering themselves and only now coming forward? Those kind of things, but those commonalities, I think those are important.
Well, I think, like you said, BearX, there is some significance to stereotypes in some cases. Like, for example, we did have a circumstance in, for example, a chat room where a wolf Therian just casually talking about foods caused like real panic in a deer Therian who happened to be reading, because if you suddenly read about death and destruction and bleeding and everything, can be quite distressing. And so you have these different perspectives by different stereotypes, and there are differences. Like there are times when it does make sense to kind of separate the community a bit. I know that I've had experiences that I really felt like I couldn't talk to anybody about because they were like very wolf specific, and I didn't like. In my environment, there weren't enough wolves for me to feel like other people would understand what I'm saying, you know. So I do think that there are like times when what your stereotype is very important, and you should use that. But at the same time, it feels like sometimes this unique stereotype thing becomes like a bit of one of those special snowflake cases. You know, people want to be unique. It's a very common human trait. It's like something that everybody has, and sometime in kindergarten you learn to keep it under wraps because it's just not that appropriate sometimes to like express your need for uniqueness all the time, right? But this is like something that's hard for some people to actually accomplish, and so sometimes unique stereotype becomes an excuse to isolate yourself in your own private group. We have like bird exclusive places and so forth, and this is just I think this isn't really useful for the community because the smaller groups that we make, the harder it is for the individual people to actually find resources that they can use. So we also had a poll on this on the Therian Guide forums, and most people think that we should stick together and be a common Therian community.
So I want to piggyback on Bear's statement about feeling like the only bear in a sea of wolves. I've actually kind of made that comment myself about being a tiger. I know the first few times that I wanted to go into the community, I was looking at forums and I'm like, okay, wolf, 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 dog, wolf, wolf, wolf. And it didn't seem like there were many active tigers. So it almost made me wonder if I had a place there. And I was kind of still naive in that mindset. You talk about having a unique stereotype becoming an excuse to isolate yourself, Dusty. And I actually kind of did it the other way around. Like I almost wondered if I even had a place because I was a specific stereotype. But it's very interesting because especially since becoming more involved with Therian Guide, I kind of see that I'm more of a piece of like a bigger puzzle. I hate to use a bunch of metaphors, but it's like we're this big machine and I'm like one cog within it that helps move everything. It's like maybe my stereotype has a specific role within the entire community. So again, it might be good to kind of think about or to introspect on what your stereotype means, but you're still a member of the community either way. You can choose to exclude yourself for any number of reasons, but it's kind of more, it makes more sense to try to work together and build together. And they also mentioned the species specific chats. I was guilty of making one of those because I wanted to kind of get felines in one place and see, okay, are there any like behavioral similarities between a bunch of the felines? Like, is there anything that we can learn from having a group of these like stereotype individuals together? But it does serve to almost fragment in a negative way because while you can gain some insights about felines specifically, you have to make sure that you take those and you apply them back with the community proper. It doesn't do anyone good if you find out that your specific clique has this specific thing. If you isolate it from the rest of the community, sometimes you can learn something that let's say I say something about a certain trait. Well, the birds may look at that and be like, hey, what's really cool is we're all like this too. It can engage in different kind of conversations and almost like a growing experience for the entire community instead of to just a subset. So I understand the need for that in a little bit of a sense, but I think there's too much focus on that fragmentation right now. All right, so if we should stick together, what is the problem with Therianthropy being merged with the term otherkin?
Well, first of all, before we begin, I wanted to point out that there is no problem that I would have with the otherkin. Some people have been spreading around the idea that Therian Guide isn't welcoming to the otherkin, and this is just not the case. You know, we have a forum dedicated specifically to the otherkin, and either way, we welcome everyone, whether or not they're a Therian. But like BearX said previously, the Therian community has originally evolved independently from the otherkin community. So, like, I understand people wanting to be like inclusive. As Therians, we each know that what it's like to be alone in our experiences, because before we learned about Therian entropy, that's what it was like for us. And I understand that this makes us unlikely to want to exclude anyone from this community that we're now building. However, I still think it's important to note that being a Therian and being an otherkin are two different things. And like there are many young people who don't really understand what Therian entropy is yet. Like they've come online, they've discovered this community, but they're not spend that much time introspecting about it yet. They would come around and say like Therians and the otherkin and the fiction kin, like they're all the same thing, right? They're all kin, right? I think these people are like forgetting that behind these words and definitions, there are like actual experiences by actual people, which are not all the same. There are differences, right? So I think, why is this important? I think understanding these differences is very important when we talk to scientists about Therian entropy, because without these particularities, the only thing that scientists can draw from looking at our community is that we're like these new age fans of animals hanging out on the internet and thinking that we're unique, because that's the only thing that we all have in common, and that it's nothing more. And that's actually one group of Australian scientists determined exactly that. And we all know this is not true. We all know that theriantropy is this unique experience of being an animal, and we all actually come online not to hang out together, but so that we can talk about these experiences. And these experiences still need to be documented by science, and grouping everything together really doesn't do us any favors.
Yeah, thinking about what Dusty said there, I don't have any problem with otherkin either, not conceptually or actually, but I do feel like it's important to keep the independent cultures that evolved there independent. I do worry that that some aspects may be lost. In the past, one of the reasons I hold so strongly to the view that therianthropy is more than an identity is because that's how it was in the past, and I feel like reducing it to purely an identity when it comes along with huge sets of other experiences is trivializing it, and I suppose that maintaining that culture is important. And when you lose things like howls and some of the other things that were part of the community, it's somewhat depressing, yeah, at least for me.
All right. Now I know that we've mentioned a few times the research team that has been working with us. So I wanted to kind of segue for just a moment. We can provide the link for this in the notes for this too. The team that we've been working with is the International Anthropomorphic Research Project, IARP. They're also known as For Science. They actually have a Therian/otherkin survey. I know we've already linked it on TG before. I want to say that we did it shortly after Anthrocon this year. It's very important for you, if you have the time. It's like an essay-based questionnaire of sorts. It does take a while to complete, but basically it asks for you to explain your experiences, and it's for, again, Therian and otherkin. So if you do have the time to what we can do is go ahead and link the page that goes to. We would appreciate it if you take the time. It does take, I think, 3 hours to complete it. I want to say the thread that we linked originally, we asked people how long it took for them to complete it. But at any rate, it is vital for the IARP team to have this kind of information to help them formulate a better understanding of what our experience is. All right, so both of you, what do you think we should strive to change in the future of the community?
Well, I think at the moment we're on the right path. There's different groups. We're visible. We're talking. A lot of the aspects of community are sort of happening again, and I think it's fantastic. I do think we need to keep asking questions. I think we need to find more of those answers. Trying to get folks to understand what's going on and try to figure out, what is the historical context of therianthropy. And obviously, it's not new, it's not unique. I've often wondered if during the Inquisition, the hundreds of thousands of people who were burned at the stake for werewolfery, were some of them Therians. It would be interesting to know if we could, reach back through time and find those things out. And there's other things. Why is autism so common in the Therian community? There's a lot of those kind of things. Why is there so much overlap with other identity communities? Why is it that when all throughout the Therian community, there's a much higher percentage of folks who are transgender or have sexualities that the numbers don't match those of the mainstream. So why is that? And how can we better work with the furry community? For a long time, there was animosity between the Therian community and the furry community, despite the fact that there were a lot of Therians who were furries and vice versa. Yeah. So it's those kind of things, the political issues, I think, and I mean political in the global scheme of politics, interaction with other communities and interaction with the mainstream. And I think those are going to be the biggest challenges going forward.
I think I agree that there's questions we need to ask, and I think one important thing that we should be doing is we should be talking about our experiences more, because that is the best way to understand our therianthropy, either individually or as a community. There's been a lot of focus on instead on definitions and words and whether or not you belong to a certain group or not, and it's a lot more important to talk about your actual experiences, because we need to really understand what each of us is experiencing, and that is really the best way to understand therianthropy. And I think this is very important.
And to kind of bounce off that too, I know I mentioned in one of the earlier podcasts that I also had this issue with. I'm kind of hesitant to describe some of my experiences sometimes because of I've gone through grilling before, and I've had people kind of pick my experiences apart. But it's kind of what we bounced off of earlier on this podcast. Until we really get a large collection of experiences to compare off of each other, we don't really know what legitimately lies within the realm of therianthropy and what doesn't. Sometimes it's very, there have been several times I've posted about something and I've been like, I'm sure people are going to just kind of groan over what I'm saying, but it's actually clicked with a lot of people and it started different conversations. So I agree, it's very important to have those experiences. It can be a very personal thing to talk about them, but it can also help us in such a large way understand better what is therianthropy. It's still something that we are trying to figure out. I also wanted to piggyback again on what BearX said. I mentioned IARP, and they, along with the otherkin and Therian survey, they also have several other surveys on the site. One of them is the furry survey, and I think it touches autism and a few things like that too, just to get a feel for what percentage of the furry community falls into which categories. There's also an autism specific survey. You don't have to identify, or not identify, you don't have to have been diagnosed with autism to take it. But again, the more information this specific team has, the better conclusions they can arrive as far as, okay, what percentage of Therians have this, which percentage don't, and then from a scientific perspective, what is the Therian makeup? All right, so one final question, because I think it's important, and I see the word used now and then in the community. I've actually used it before and had people kind of slap my wrist over it. Do either of you consider yourselves to be gray muzzles, and what does that word mean to you? Who should actually use it?
Well, it's funny you should mention that. I mean, the first time I encountered this word, it was already like a bit cringy to actually use it because, um, you know, sometimes we get on TG, we get like new people registering who like were only familiar with thermientropy for like maybe 5 years or even less. And they say, okay, they're gray muzzles, because they are the oldest people that are Therians that they ever knew. And like, this is like, I mean, I understand this, but like BearX here has like 26 years of experience with thermientropy, and he doesn't call himself a gray muzzle. So in comparisons, it's hard. So I think it's impossible for us. Every Therian community is isolated in a way. We don't know if there are other people who are older than us and so forth, and so we can never know if we're like qualified to call ourselves gray muzzles. I may have had a gray hair or two from work stress at times, but I still don't feel like I'm ready to call myself a gray muzzle.
I don't really have a problem with the word. But I've always felt the way that I saw it used initially was the most appropriate. It was like a term of respect. Like, if you felt that this other Therian was more knowledgeable or deserving or deserved respect, then, you would consider them a gray muzzle. But it wasn't something that anyone would ever call themselves because it seemed arrogant to do so. And I've met young Therians with very small amounts of experience who I felt significant respect for because they were treating the material respectfully, and they were, honestly on this journey and truly exploring that their feelings. And I might say, wow, that guy's a gray muzzle, or that gal's a gray muzzle, they're a gray muzzle, because to me that was the term of respect. However, I think Dusty's right too, in that it's cringy. In the modern community especially, it seems very cringy to use. I don't know. It's hard to say. I think it's just a personal choice, but you won't catch me calling myself a gray muzzle.
So when I first joined Amino, I did my introduction, and I actually called myself a gray muzzle. But I was joking again because I was I think I was 32 when I joined, and it seems like the majority of the crowd is much younger there. Well, I also kind of I'm a Therian and I'm a furry. Well, on the furry side, it seems like the term is used much more loosely. It still is a term of respect, but it's almost like if you're over a certain age, it's almost acceptable to say that. I understand that it's still, again, it's a thing of respect. But from the Therian perspective, the term itself seems to have actually been one that has been abused at times. It's almost one of those things where it's like, if you have to call yourself a gray muzzle in front of other people, why are you doing that specifically? Why do you need to call yourself that? I would be sort of leery of someone being like, "Hi, I'm a gray muzzle," almost in the same way that if I saw someone, say, "Hi, I'm an alpha." Why do you kind of try to push that label on yourself? What are you trying to get out of it? And again, it's kind of, what has the individual contributed to the community? What kind of roles do they have? If someone has given a lot of support to the community, then sure, the term may actually be very appropriate. But I think it's interesting or I think it's important to kind of question why someone would identify as that and what they're using that label for. As long as they're using it for good, then I still kind of do say it jokingly every now and then. And I know a few people that do, but I would be more worried if someone approaches it almost as if they are an authority because they call themselves a great muzzle, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it certainly makes sense to me.
All right, so thank you for your time, and we're just about out of ours. So happy holidays to everyone, no matter what you celebrate or what you don't. Celebrate life, celebrate your friends. We also would like to point you again to the IARP. Again, that's the International Anthropomorphic Research Project, or the First Science Team. We would like to point you to their different surveys. Again, it's for science. And as always, we'd like additional topics for these interviews. If you haven't yet, please check out the thread that's titled Interviews, What Things Should We Discuss, or What Kinds of Things Should We Discuss? It's located in the Therian polling area of our forums under Therianthropy board. And we would appreciate it if you submit your ideas for future topics. So I would again like to thank both DustWolf and BearX for coming on this time. And
you're very welcome. Thanks for having me, Zeph. And if folks want to chat with me when I'm around, feel free to ask any questions. I'm pretty knowledgeable about the early history of the community. So, folks still have questions, I'm happy to answer them.
I think we're sure to invite Bear at least for another interview. So thanks for coming this time, really. Nice talking to you.
It was nice talking to you too, Dusty. Thanks for having me.